This episode of the Children's Literature Podcast is brought to you by Shaking Christmas Presents. Shaking Christmas Presents. Pro tip, do it gently and you're way more likely to get away with it. Welcome to the Children's Literature Podcast. I'm your host, TQ Townsend. This episode is about the best Christmas pageant ever. I'm a big fan of stories about human flaws. Not mean, cynical stories, but the ones that just admit, yeah, none of us are perfect, and sometimes that's pretty funny. Fewer books capture this better than The Best Christmas Pageant Ever by Barbara Robinson. This is a story about a small-town church that puts on its annual Christmas pageant, what they'd call a nativity play in Britain and many other parts of the English-speaking world. And nothing goes according to plan. The 6 kids from the Herdman family, a pack of smoking, drinking, swearing, school-skipping reprobates, decide to get involved. They take lead roles, much to the consternation of the church folk who are used to their Christmas pageant following a nicely predictable pattern. But somehow, the Herdmans help everyone rediscover not just Christmas traditions, but the Christmas story itself. During the performance, they make a lot of changes. The girl playing Mary refuses to leave the baby in the manger, preferring to rock it in her arms the way a real mother would. The 3 brothers playing the wise men decide that strange things like gold, frankincense, and myrrh are silly presents to give a baby, and instead they bring a ham from the charity basket that had been delivered to the family. I appreciate that as an extra ironic illustration of the Herdman's ignorance, given that a ham would be a totally inappropriate gift to a Jewish family. The youngest Herdman child, a nasty little bully named Gladys, is able to genuinely terrify the shepherds when she takes on the role of announcing Jesus' birth. Somehow the whole thing ends up being a genuinely moving experience. And in the end, the townsfolk have to admit that it really was the best Christmas pageant ever. This story's greatest strength is that whether or not you're Christian, you'll love it. It's so well told, and it's so funny. It isn't really about Christian doctrine so much as the way human beings handle it when their principles run headlong into reality. It's also about the fact that in our communities we have to deal with people who are totally obnoxious. These are people who are very hard to like, and if we're honest, none of us would miss them if they moved away. But they are here. They're in our village, and we've got to deal with that. That's something every human being can relate to. The Best Christmas Pageant Ever deals with the problem of people who are not easy to love in a Christian context. The characters in the book are supposed to be living up to values such as charity, patience, compassion, and forgiveness, but as every one of us knows, having principles and living up to them are 2 entirely different things. And people like the Herdman kids make it really, really difficult. Robinson did something really clever. The narrator of the story is the daughter of the Christmas pageant's director. If the story were narrated in the 3rd person, or if the narrator was an adult, it wouldn't be nearly as funny, because it would be regulated by an adult's sense of tact and self-control. By having little Elizabeth Bradley narrate the story, we get to hear an unfiltered commentary with no editing to the negative opinions everyone has about the Herdmans. Everyone in the congregation is astonished, bewildered, and sometimes offended by the wild kids' behavior. And their behavior's pretty bad. The story opens with an account of how they recently burned down some poor guy's tool shed. They terrorize their classmates and shoplift from local stores. The only reason any of them keep moving up a grade each year in school is because no teacher wants to have more than one Herdman to deal with at once. These kids are so badly behaved that it's questionable if it's even safe to include them in the play, as they intimidate the other children and use the church bathroom for smoke breaks during rehearsals. The characters of the Herdmans are believable because Robinson doesn't try to apologize for them, nor does she give them some kind of overdramatic transformation that just isn't plausible in real life. She does provide enough information to explain why the kids are so badly behaved. Their dad walked out on the family years ago, and the mother has to work multiple jobs just to keep them at a manageable level of poverty. This book was published in 1971, a time when single mothers were still very much looked down upon. Mrs. Herdman is on her own. She has to work to feed her kids, but that means she isn't a stay-at-home mother like all the other women in town, and when she does finally make it home, she's too exhausted for stuff like discussions on morality. Nobody in town has ever thought to help her, but they have thought a lot about how much they blame her for being unable to raise perfect little angels while doing the work that's normally split between a mother and father and usually some extended family as well. The result is that her kids have grown up feral, angry, and without anyone to teach them to behave any better. Nobody cares about them, so why would they care about anyone? While Barbara Robinson didn't model the Herdmans on any specific children, her own life story would have given her some insight into how much easier it is to be a good kid when you come from a family with enough people and resources. Robinson was born in Ohio in 1927, and her father died when she was 3 years old, right at the start of the Great Depression. But there were a few things that gave Robinson much better chances in life than the Herdman kids. She was an only child to start, and her mother had a good job as a schoolteacher, so she didn't grow up with the stress and uncertainty of deep poverty. She also wouldn't have grown up being looked down upon for being poor, and she had a large extended family in her neighborhood to help raise her. But because of her own experiences with losing a father, she still would have had some insight into just how hard it is for a single mother to do the work of 2 people with no chance of a break. If Robinson had 5 more siblings, and if her mother hadn't been an educated professional with a strong family around her, she easily could have ended up like one of the Herdman kids. Instead, she grew up with a loving family that stepped up, and she went off to university where she studied theater. You can see how that influenced the best Christmas pageant ever as well, as it's all about a play. About 10 years after the book was published, Robinson would actually adapt the story into a play, which is still quite popular in the United States. When kids read this book, they're going to latch on to the drama of having a bunch of absolute maniacs take over the church play. That's certainly what I paid attention to as a kid, but revisiting this story as a grown-up, I was blown away by how Robinson seamlessly blends hilarious comedy with a really thoughtful exploration of faith. The Herdman kids show up at the church only because they heard that there would be free snacks. They have no interest in religion, and all the regular churchgoers are terrified of them, but nobody can kick them out because they're technically supposed to follow through on that whole everyone welcome thing. The Herdmans volunteer for roles in the Christmas pageant, which astonishes the director, but all the other kids are too scared to challenge any of them. Surprisingly, the Herdmans take quite a lot of interest in the Christmas story, but that's because they've never heard it before. I think this is a good reminder to all of us not to take familiar tales for granted. When you know a story really well, you can stop paying close attention to it. Because the plot of the Nativity is unfamiliar, the Herdmans notice things that nobody ever bothered paying attention to. In a very funny way, this alludes to the Old Testament book of Psalms, which says that out of the mouths of young children will come great truths. Often there will be a book that I've read 100 times, and I think I know everything there is to know about it. And then some booger-faced kid will give me the pleasant surprise of pointing out something I never considered, because they were able to look at the book with a fresh point of view. In those circumstances, I'm delighted to have my mind opened in the least likely way. So when the Herdmans ask questions like, why didn't somebody just hand the baby over to King Herod? Or, why would you give a baby gold, frankincense, and myrrh instead of diapers and food? The response shouldn't be, you shouldn't ask things like that, but rather, that's a good point. The Best Christmas Pageant Ever thoughtfully points out that people who are familiar with religious tradition can sometimes just be going through the motions. They don't actually engage with the stories and take them seriously. If you're a person of faith and you take your faith seriously, you should be willing to question it, challenge it, and engage with it. Anything worth believing in should be able to withstand a good examination. In fact, after a thorough inspection, beliefs worth having should be stronger than ever. If they collapse after the slightest push, then they didn't have much value to begin with. So while the Herdmans are not polished in the way they examine the Christmas story, they are sincere. I think parents and teachers should do their best to answer children's sincere questions about stories, both religious and secular, and never say things like, "Don't ask questions like that." If you don't have an answer, don't let that make you uneasy. Just be honest and encourage your kids to keep thinking. Not all questions have easy or quick answers. Some never get answered at all. But it's still better that the questions get asked rather than dismissed. I have always appreciated the way that works of comedy have encouraged me to think about very serious issues. Somehow, hard thinking is easier when I'm able to have a good laugh on the way in. Whether or not you're a Christian, the humor, humanity, and reality of the best Christmas pageant ever will be well worth your time. It's a book that'll remind you to stick to your principles, even when it means including those whom the rest of society has written off. Because sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes, it means you have the chance to rediscover your values and the stories that strengthen them. You've been listening to the Children's Literature Podcast. Please subscribe and give the show a rating. Send comments to letters@children'sliteraturepodcast.com. I'm your host, TQ Townsend. Thanks for listening.